a lot of new terms. So I want to go through those with you. The first thing they talk about here is the difference between narrative and lyric poetry. Oh, you know what? I found something out. Hold on. I found out that you can draw right here on the Zoom. It's probably something everybody else knew weeks ago, but I just figured it out. In any case, it's good to think about whether a poem is narrative or lyric. And you can almost do that in step 1 of the 1, 2, 3 analysis. If it's a narrative poem, it's good to know that because you can use then the tools of narration to help you figure out the poem and crack it open. You can think about character, and you can think about antagonists, and you can think about conflict and setting and all of those things that might be present in the poem to help you work on your ideas for the poem. So if it's a narrative poem, in some ways it's a little bit easier. If it's a lyric poem, then it's philosophical in nature. It doesn't tell a story like, you know, with the Freytag's pyramid. It just talks about, you know, a concept, maybe emotions or something abstract. And so there are different tools that you have to use to start figuring out lyric poems. There are some examples that they give you here in the text. Oh, the little things stay there. Okay, hold on. Well, that's not handy. Okay, I thought it would scroll up, but I guess it just does that on the screen. All right, so I don't need to annotate. In the narrative poetry section, it talks about 2 different types of narrative poetry, and these are like the 2 big ones. We either see epic poems, which are book-length poems about the adventures of a hero, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, Beowulf are epics. The example they give is Paradise Lost there. And those are long and have a very specific structure. A ballad is a shorter poem that is usually telling a story about a relationship or a war or some person and what they went through, that kind of thing. So they're completely different types, but these are both the 2 main types of narrative poetry that we see. The lyric types that they have here are, they list a handful of them. There are others, but I wanted to go through them so that if you see an example of them, you will know what they are. Some of these are from specific time periods. Like, people don't really write pastorals anymore. That's from, you know, the 17th century, 18th century. Second semester in this course is completely different than this semester. Second semester is a historical look at literature, British literature from the beginning, the origins of the English language to contemporary times. And in that course, we'll talk about some of these forms. We don't have time in this semester to go through examples of all of these types, but you kind of need to know that there are types of lyric poetry and what the types are. By the way, some of you, I think I mentioned this last time, some of you will be taking the second semester of this course and some of you will not be taking the second semester of this course. I don't want that to be a surprise to you because the first time that happened 2 years ago, it was a surprise to people. If you are doing the biology degree, I think is the one that does not need the second semester of this course, the 23-21 course. And they will put you into regular English for second semester, just so that you know. But the other degree plans, I think, can use 23-21, which is next semester. Anyway, next semester is more historical. Let's go through these a little bit and I'll explain each one. You should have notes on all of them. The semester exam is going to cover all these bold terms that you've been taking notes on all this time. That's why I go through them. So an elegy is a poem that people write in honor of somebody who has passed away and is usually a sad poem for that reason. There are sometimes famous elegies for famous people, and sometimes there are elegies for people that represent and symbolically groups of people, things like that. An ode is a lyric poem that is praising something. So I could have an ode to a sunny day, or an ode to the Olympic champion. An aubade is a poem about morning, M-O-R-N-I-N-G, like dawn. And they don't say it in the book, but I will tell you that an aubade is sometimes a poem about the next morning after a romantic rendezvous and the sun comes up, and like, just think Romeo and Juliet, right? So an aubade can sometimes be a poem that people write in that situation. I'm not going to say anything more about that. I think we all get the picture. An occasional poem is not a poem that a poet writes sometimes. It's a poem that a poet writes for a specific occasion. So if I wrote a poem that was in memory of the people who died on 9/11, then that would be an occasional poem because it's on the occasion of the anniversary of 9/11 or something like that. If I wrote a poem for somebody's birthday, then that would be an occasional poem because it's for that occasion. A meditation is kind of a general term, but a meditation is when a person is thinking very deeply in a lyric poem about a concept. Usually they clue in on something that is concrete and it leads them to abstract ideas. So there's like a symbolic element usually to a meditation. You know, I'm looking at this dead flower and it makes me think about the transitions between life and death, and that makes me think about, you know, so it takes you into more philosophical realms, usually a meditation. A pastoral, like I said, that is a type of poem that people don't really write anymore. They're from the 16th and 17th century generally. But a pastoral is a poem about, you know, the simple life out in the country, the rolling hills and the sheep. There's usually a shepherd or two in the poem and they're singing. It's about that kind of life. Not usually very deep, the pastoral poems. And then the last one that they mention here is dramatic monologue, which is when a speaker takes on a persona other than themselves and creates a character from which they are speaking, almost like a soliloquy in a play. So the speaker then takes on that persona and addresses the audience, who's meant to be silent. So in that way, it's like a soliloquy from a play. And usually they reveal in that poem more than, you know, what's going on in their mind, or maybe they'll reveal their complicity in a crime or something like that. So dramatic monologue is revealing about the character of the person. So that's just a handful of types of lyric poetry, but basically anything that's not narrative falls into lyric poetry. So there are tons of different types of lyric poetry that we can examine. The book just gives you these. Is there anything that you want me to talk about more specifically? More detail? Okay. The other thing that you were supposed to take notes on for today is part of the chapter on figures of speech. I know that you already know about metaphor and simile and personification. They've been going through that stuff for years with you. The difference, I think, now is that we're looking at more challenging poetry, and we're also looking at these tropes, as they're called, as a way of analyzing in a more academic way. So in other words, we're not just pointing out that there's a metaphor, we're talking about the function of the metaphor and why that metaphor exists and what we're supposed to understand through the comparison that's presented. So this chapter does a good job, I think, of showing you poems and then giving you commentary about that. For example, you know, there are several poems in this section that they spend time talking about, and this is what your formative should start sounding like. This is using terminology and talking about the way the metaphor is being used in the poem. So reading this chapter is an example for you about how we talk about metaphor in poetry. Not just pointing it out, not just saying, oh, there is a metaphor, but what is the purpose and the function of the metaphor? How is it working in the poem? So I don't know if they talk to you when you're first learning about metaphor, simile, and personification about the difference between simile and metaphor conceptually. I know that they're going to tell you, well, a simile uses like or as and a metaphor doesn't. I know that you know that. But I think that you need to think also about why you might, if you're comparing two things, why would you use a simile over a metaphor if you were a poet? And I think that's something that they don't spend a lot of time talking about. So I want you to add that to your notes. If you didn't take any notes in this section because all this stuff is familiar to you, then at least write this down. So the idea is that a metaphor is generally more bold and forceful than a simile, because a metaphor is a replacement. It's saying the thing for the thing. I'm comparing the things by saying this thing is the other thing. A simile is a softer comparison because it's not saying that the two things are the same, it's saying one thing is like another thing. So let me give you an example of how that works. If I was sitting at the dinner table and my sister was sitting across from me and she was not paying attention at all to her manners, and she had spaghetti flying out of her mouth and spit, and she was just eating it with her hands, I might say, "You're a pig." That's a metaphor. And that is a strong comparison because I'm saying you could literally take a pig and the pig would be doing the same thing that you're doing right here. It's the same. And it might be rude for me to say that, but it's also rude for my sister to eat like that. But in any case, the metaphor is a strong indictment of the behavior of my sister. But if I said to her instead, "You're eating like a pig, stop it," it's still the same comparison, but it's sort of like you're only like a pig in this one moment, right? Like you're not a pig in everything you do. You're a pig as you're eating here right now. So a simile is sort of like a metaphor light in a way, because we're just sort of associating the two things together, sort of. In a metaphor, we're saying they're the same. And so it's a harsher, more striking comparison. So I don't think we always think about that because I think we're just about looking for the word like and looking for the word as, or if it's not there and saying whether it's a simile or a metaphor. But a poet can emphasize based on their choice of making something like something else or something to be something else. Personification down here, just remember that personification is a type of metaphor, so you don't have to nail it down as personification. It's an easier metaphor in a way because personification, you already know one half of the metaphor. One half of the metaphor is a person. So whatever you're comparing it to is being compared to a person. So you only really have to figure out the other half of the personification. But it's going to be a metaphor. Okay, so then they give you this poem Harlem, which you probably have read before, maybe. And then they give you some commentary. This, I think, is especially important to read because it gives you the way that we talk about poetry. And the more you read that, the more that will start to seep into your papers and your formatives and, you know, God willing, our discussions, if we get to have them at some point in time. So they talk about, in this part, about extended simile and extended metaphor. This poem, Constantly Risking Absurdity, is an extended simile. It says right here, the poet like an acrobat. So in this case, the poet is being compared to having some of the qualities of an acrobat. And it's an extended simile because the whole poem then goes on to talk about the different qualities of an acrobat and how they overlap with the qualities of a poet. So a poet is not an acrobat. He is very similar to an acrobat and they do similar things, but not in the literal sense. right? Like a poet doesn't have to write while they're up on the high wire. So this whole poem makes that comparison and just gives sort of a lot of secondary similes about how they're similar. And the same thing happens with extended metaphor. They give an example there. So there's an example of extended metaphor. I think you've worked with those in the past also. And then after that are just a bunch of poems with some questions. I'm not a big fan of asking you to read something and just answer some questions. I find that to be kind of juvenile and old-fashioned. I don't know. Whenever I have had students do that in the past, they usually just put some idea without a lot of detail, and I don't know what happens in previous years if people just get credit for doing something or whatever. But I'd rather ask like one good question on a formative than these questions that you turn in or have a good, conversation. If we were in class, we might talk about some of these questions. I think they would be good for discussion, but I don't know. Just not a big, we were doing that back when I was in school. Read this and answer these questions. It's okay, but anyway, there's some really good poems in this section, and you can practice what you learned about extended metaphor, extended simile in a lot of these, like this one. And this is a really tough poem, but every English teacher's favorite. I think that's it for this section. So I'll just pretty much examples, and I did not assign the hyperbole and understatement section. So are there any questions about that reading assignment? Anything you want me to go over? Okay, well, this week the focus is on form, and so the reading assignment is from the text on form. And just to get your feet wet on that a little bit, I wanted to talk about these poems that we had for this week. All three poems are about night, and some of the questions I have for you on formative this week are comparing the different ideas about night that are present in those poems. But I want to talk specifically about how one of them has a very specific form, and the other two are more what we might call free verse. Nightfall and Wild Nights are poems that don't conform to a specific pattern. And so we call that open form. And you're going to read about this next week. I'm just giving you a little bit of, background. Open form means that the poet doesn't conform to a specific prescribed organizational pattern. Some poems have rules about the way that they're organized, but in the 1800s, people started writing poetry that didn't conform to rules. And so now we have a variety of poets who do not follow patterns of poetry. But Acquainted with the Night is a specific kind of poem, and I want to open it up and talk about the form. I know that you've already read this poem and worked with it, but I want to talk about it. Where are my tools? I want to talk about it because I think that it's important to kind of preview a little bit about form. And this poem is what we call a terza rima poem. And they do mention that in the reading assignment, but make sure that you spell it right. Terza rima. I know that if I didn't spell it out, there'd be all kinds of spellings in the notebook. A terza rima poem is almost like a sonnet if you've studied sonnets before. If you haven't studied sonnets before, then you will this week because we have 3 sonnets for our assignment and the book talks about sonnet form. But terza rima has 14 lines like a sonnet, and it has 10 syllables per line like a sonnet, but the rhyme scheme is different. And with terza rima, it's set up with what we call interlocking or interlaced rhyme. So if you can look on the ends here, it has A, B, A, night, rain, light. Then it has C, B, C, because, wait, it has C, A, no, B, B, C, B, yeah. And then feet is D, but then, no, feet is C. C, D, C, and then D, A, D, and then A, A. So for it to be terzarima, it has to have 10 syllables per line, 4 stanzas of 3 lines each, and it has to rhyme with this interlocking. The middle line is the next double line rhyme scheme, if that makes sense. So that's really constricting if you're trying to write a poem. If you're trying to write a poem and get an idea across in a beautiful, poignant way, that's a lot of extra baggage to have to figure out when you're writing a poem. But Robert Frost was successful with it with this poem. Also, this poem has a form that we could say includes repetition. We have, let me make a circle over here. I'm excited about my tools here. We have this, oh. Sorry, I had to. We have this repetition of I have, and it comes out down here too, right? We have, I have. So the repetition of I have is something that we have to contemplate in this poem too. That's not part of terzarima. That's a decision that Robert Frost made in order to emphasize the experience of the speaker, right? This speaker it's not the first time he's ever walked out in the rain at night. He is acquainted with the night because he does this frequently. So the I have underscores, that repetition underscores the different experiences and the sort of wisdom of the speaker in that process. So when we look at poetry in terms of form, those are the sorts of things that we look at. What's being repeated? Is there a certain closed form structure that we can say the poem conforms to? And then we also include our 1, 2, 3 analysis and all of that stuff. So I think I have to erase all of these things now. There should be a button that you can just press and clear it. But wait, is it clear all? Clear all drawings. Oh, well, what do you know? Anyway, that's just a little bit of a preview for you about form. I want you to read these pages, a few pages in your text about form, take some notes. And then there are 3 poems for you to look at. They're all different types of sonnets for next Tuesday. These 2 are in the textbook. This one is not. But again, choose which way works for you to make your notes. You can do Post-its in the book. You can print them out. I put the PDFs and the docs here for you if you wanted to print them. If you want to do them virtually, you can. I don't know if I ever shared with you this tool that you can download. There's a Chrome add-on or extension that you can use on all your PDFs. It's how I sign stuff. It's how I do letters of recommendation and stuff. It's called Cami. It's free. So you can, if you want to get text boxes, like if you decide that you want to, it's still doing the eraser. There's the text box. And then you can move it around and, shape it as necessary. So if you wanted to do a virtual annotation, that's fine, as long as it has all of the 1, 2, 3 parts for the 1, 2, 3 analysis. I did an example of 1, 2, 3 analysis on the video. I think I did another one in class last time. So there's plenty of examples of what the stages are for the 1, 2, 3 analysis. You can draw, you can do shapes, you can erase, all those things. So Cami is a good tool, and then you can export it and just save it right in your Google Drive if you want, or you can download it. You can save it to your Google Drive or what have you. So I think Cami is a good tool. If you want to print it out, you can. There's whatever tool works for you in your situation. But there are 3 poems for next week. All right. The last thing I want to talk about today is the project that we are going to do for poetry We're not going to be writing a poetry paper. We have one more paper to write this term, and it is a research paper that we'll do when we're in the drama unit. But I want to talk about the poetry analysis lesson. I did put it up last week so that you could start to get a feel for it and kind of have a heads up about the project. The first part of it is due on the 31st of October. So let me go through the assignment with you, answer any questions, because this week you should be picking out a poem or two, and then next week you should be filming your video. So what I want you to do is make a video of about 10 minutes. I'm going to give you a grace of 2 minutes on either side, so somewhere between 8 and 11 or 12 minutes, where you do an explication of a poem that you have chosen. Now, I want for the poem to be about a social issue. You can choose the issue, you can choose the poem. It can be a contemporary issue, something that we're dealing with right now. It can be a historical issue. You can go back, you know, to the 19th century and find some poetry about the suffrage movement or what have you, Civil War. But I want you to create a 10-minute video in which you do an explication. You do not have to appear in your video if you don't want to. You certainly can, but you need to explain the poem, and you can just use the 1, 2, 3 analysis if you want. You can go through a 1, 2, 3 and explain the poem and connect it with the social issue. So the goal is to sort of teach the poem in a way to your classmates. And that part of it is a major grade. There is another part to this project, which is after everybody posts their videos, we're gonna post in Blackboard. I'll show you, we're gonna do that in the discussion board. But we'll post there, and then everybody will need to watch 2 of their classmates' videos and do some commentary and that sort of thing with the poem afterwards. And that deadline is a little bit later on. So the first part is for the 31st, where you post your video, and then I think it's until the 4th of November that you have to look at your classmates. Can we read the poem? Yeah, you should always read the poem before you do. I think that it gives people an orientation to the poem in general. So those are 2 separate grades. The first grade is uploading the video, and then, you know, creating and uploading the video. And then the second part is where you'll look at some classmates' work. I do have a few requirements, because what would a project be without requirements? You need to choose a poem, or you can also choose a pair of poems if you want. I don't think you should do more than 2, because it's a 10-minute video, and I want you to make sure that you address, you know, the poems in depth. And if you have too many poems, then you just have to skim over them. But choose a poem that addresses a social issue of interest to you. I'll let you choose what that is. Choose something that you feel comfortable talking about. Don't choose a topic, you know, don't choose a poem about abortion if you don't want to talk about abortion. You know, like, pick a topic that is interesting to you or you feel passionate and strongly about. And find some poems. They should be published in some way in a fixed location, in a book, in a journal. They can be online, they can be in a video, but they should be in a fixed spot where you can go and source it. And you can say, okay, here's the source for that. I put some beginning places, resources down here where you can start to find poems that might fit the bill. You don't have to use these sources. You can just go and do your own searching if you want to. But if you need a place to start, I did put some links down here. I also put a link about using iMovie, which I think is the easiest video editor. You can even do it right on your phone. There's an app and it's free. So if you have an iPhone, it's probably already on your phone. They sneak stuff in there and it's permanent. Do pick poems that have been formally published, and do not use an anonymous poem, and do not use an internet pseudonym poem. There are lots of websites that encourage people to upload their own original poetry. I think that's fantastic. I think that the more we talk about poetry, the better world it is. But for an academic assignment, I want you to use something that is, you know, more academic. For example, what I mean by internet pseudonym is if you look to see who wrote the poem, you say, oh, this one would be perfect. It's about Black Lives Matter or whatever. And then you look down to see who wrote it and it says, you know, Evil Spawn 69. That is not a legit poem for this project. If you can figure out the actual name of Devil Spawn 69, then fine, go and figure out who that person is. But in academic circles, we don't spend time talking about poems that people don't want to put their name on. So do find something that works in that academic level. If you're not sure and you find a poem that you like, send it to me or send the link to me and I'll look at it and say, yeah, go for it. I think it's fine. Or, I don't know, Sparkle Princess 22 isn't, you know, up there with, you know, Robert Frost. And then there are some requirements here for the video. I want it to be roughly around 10 minutes. I don't want it to be so long that people avoid watching your video because it's too long. I want them to be all about 10 minutes. It needs to contain audio and visual elements. In other words, we don't want to watch the video and it's just you talking with nothing on the screen. So if you want to, you can set up your phone so that you have a stand and you can just do a 1, 2, 3 analysis. You can set up a PowerPoint where you walk us through the poem. You can do it whatever way you like. You can be in the video pointing things out. You can use Screencastify, which is a free tool that a lot of teachers use when they're making their lessons. So if you're not sure how you want to do it, communicate with me and I'll give you some ideas for tools. Maybe I'll put some of those down here for Screencastify. Okay, the explication needs to make sure that your classmates understand how the elements of poetry are creating the ideas about the social issue. So if I'm doing an explication of a poem about Black Lives Matter, then I want to talk about this metaphor in this stanza and how that contributes to the message that the poem is trying to make about that issue. So your 1, 2, 3 analysis should be focused on the theme, which should be focused on the social issue. Hopefully that makes sense. You need to include in your video 2 study questions that will help your audience gain a deeper understanding. And that's crucial because when your classmates go to watch your video, part of their responsibility, besides sort of critiquing your video, is also to answer those questions. So I want you to engage the people who are watching your video by asking them 2 study questions. They should be questions that you don't already answer in the video. Then it's not really, it's just a waste of people's time to just repeat what you already said in your video. If you need help coming up with questions, I did put a list of stems and like things that you could use to help you write study questions right here. But the end of the video should have 2 study questions, or maybe it's interspersed throughout the video, I don't know, so that whoever's watching your video can work on those questions. Now the second part, the peer evaluation, you're going to answer the questions and offer praise or praising constructive criticism about the explication. The due dates, the first part, the video is due a week from Saturday. So I would think this week you should be trying to find a good poem that you want to use for your explication and maybe planning out what your explication is going to say. And then that leaves next week for making the video. I don't know if you're going to follow that advice, that's up to you. But if you do it that way, then you don't have everything all in 1 week, because next week we're going to have reading assignments still. So if you kind of break it up a little bit, then it's a little bit here and a little bit there, and not everything all at once. And then the critique happens by the 4th. Next Tuesday, I can answer more questions about it. That way, maybe you're a little farther along on the project, and that will be 4 or 5 days before the videos are due. There is a rubric, a scoring rubric here. You can click on it if you want to. I don't think people look at them, but it is how I score the projects. This one has 2 parts to it because there are 2 parts to the assignment. So the project, the major part is making the video, and then the minor part is the peer evaluation. So this has you know, the 2 different rubrics for the 2 different assignments that are in this project. And that's pretty much it. There are these resources down here, but like I said, there are many other resources that you could find on the internet to help you with your project or help you find a poem that you would like to use. Are there any questions on the assignment?
No, ma'am.
Okay, always wait a few minutes just in case somebody is trying to unmute. I've been in plenty of meetings where they ask, is there a question? And I'm like, yes, I have a question, but by the time I unmute, they're already on to something else. So, well, I had a question from 2 minutes ago. Well, if you run into trouble or you have questions or you're not really sure what to do and you need a boost or you need a little bit of help getting started, then just communicate with me and I'll give you some ideas or some feedback, or we'll have a Zoom call and I'll help you that way. Whatever would help you. I think that's it for today. There are 3 poems for next week, but I already talked about those. And I don't know, I think that's it. Any questions? Anything I can clarify for you before we finish for today?